This country's border stretches over 4,300 kilometers from the Atacama Desert to the tip of South America, and it does it with an average width of only 170 kilometers. This video will show how Chile became the world's skinniest country through its unique history and geography. Chile's border started here. When Spanish conquerors first arrived in Chile, they found a slim strip of land between the Andes Mountains and the Pacific Ocean. Spanish settlers first populated the region in a fruitless search for gold, but they found something even more important than resource extraction. They found Chile's Central Valley. This is a climate map of Chile. This red here is a cold desert. It's not very good for living. But as we moved south, look here. This area is something really special, especially if you were Spanish. This area has a Mediterranean climate. Mediterranean climates are only found in select regions, like Spain and the Mediterranean. Outside of that, this climate type only exists in little pockets around the world, but significantly, it's found here in Chile's Central Valley. This meant that you could grow all your favorite foods from back home, like wineries, which turned up all over the Central Valley as Spanish settlement exploded around the region. It's here that we find Chile's modern capital of Santiago, which was the first Spanish settlement in Chile. The Central Valley is hemmed into the west by the Pacific Ocean, and to the east by the impassable heights of the Andes Mountains. This formed the basis of central Chile's borders. The land to the south of the Central Valley, meanwhile, was controlled by the Mapuche, a Native American group that successfully fought off Spanish attempts to take their land. Continual fighting between the Mapuche and the Spaniards resulted in this border being slowly pushed northward. Between losing land to the Mapuche and the far too common pirate attacks up the coast, something had to be done. And so Chile became a highly militarized society, with the largest armed forces on the continent. The land to the north of the Central Valley, meanwhile, was desert. And by that I mean, it was the driest desert in the world. In the south, winds come from the ocean and lose their humidity before going over the mountains. In the north, though, the winds come from the Atlantic and lose their humidity on the other side of the Andes. This extreme desert limited Chile's expansion northward. Massive instability as a result of the Napoleonic Wars caused Spanish control over the Americas to collapse. And one by one, the nations of South America declared independence. Chile was made a fully independent republic in 1818. However, now Chile had to define its official borders, a task made harder now that it had to contend with its newly independent neighbors. The new nation of Argentina controlled the other side of the Andes Mountains, and while the mountains formed a clear border in central Chile, the southern reaches of the continent, there lay the barren lands of Patagonia. And Patagonia was trouble. It was cold, largely arid, and mostly ungovernable. No European power had been able to rein in the native people of the region. It couldn't sustain agriculture, and it held few natural resources. Both Chile and Argentina claimed all of Patagonia as their own. Of strategic importance to Chile was the Strait of Magellan, a narrow water pass that allowed ships to avoid the treacherous open ocean near Antarctica. Since Chile traded mainly to Europe, it meant that if Argentina or the US or a European power was able to control that strait, it would be able to close Chile's main shipping lane and strangle its economy. To prevent this, Chile moved into the area, constructing the fortress of Fuerte Bulnes. For its part, Argentina was having trouble in the conflicts with the native forces in Patagonia, and it was concerned that Chile would aid these native forces against it. With both sides worried about the other, they chose to try and arbitrate the border peacefully. Both countries had held a turn with de jure control over Patagonia when they were still colonies, and so both came into negotiations claiming legal rights over the whole of Patagonia. But things weren't as bad as one might have suspected. Argentina prioritized having sovereign authority to operate against the natives and having more land for ranching. Chile, meanwhile, cared mainly about its control over the Strait of Magellan. Both sides seemed like they were going to reach an agreement peacefully. However, in Chile's north, conflict was just around the corner. The independent nations of Peru and Bolivia were eyeing the resource-rich Atacama Desert along the Pacific coast. You see, this desert turned out to have valuable nitrate mines. And although many Chileans owned and worked in the nitrate mines in the area, much of the land was controlled by Bolivia and Peru. The borders here had already been established during the Border Treaty of 1874. This treaty had a problem, however. It stopped Bolivia from being able to increase mining taxes within its own sovereign territory. Bolivia decided it liked revenue more than international treaties, and so it seized the mines. These mines, as mentioned a minute back, were operated and owned mainly by Chileans. Chile then declared the treaty invalid and sent its troops to occupy the Bolivian city port of Antofagasta. But Chile was in for a surprise, because Bolivia had organized a secret alliance with Peru, who then entered the war against our horizontally challenged nation. Due to the extreme desert landscape, much of the fighting was carried out by sea. Whoever controlled the sea could operate supply lines that would allow a land campaign on shore. Argentina saw Chile as being weakened due to the war and chose to end its negotiations over Patagonia, hoping for a better negotiating position after a Chilean defeat. But the winner at sea proved to be Chile, and they used their naval control to land troops up the Pacific coast. Chile forced Bolivia out of the region in the decisive Battle of Tacna, and then moved further north and occupied Peru's capital of Lima. The war had ended decisively in Chile's favor. The following peace treaty of Ancon in 1883 saw Chile acquire the resource-rich desert with land concessions from both Bolivia and Peru. Chile took territory that it had been able to control, which was by the coast. It also took this land inland. However, this land was not actually Bolivia's to give away, because Argentina had a claim to it as well. It ended up being decided that Chile could keep this piece of territory and Argentina could have the rest. In 1929, Chile returned this territory to Peru, in part to avoid future hostility with its neighbor. Argentina had taken a risk in hoping Chile would be weakened by the war. Chile's dominant position in the following peace means that it had less room to negotiation than before. Ultimately, Chile took this territory and gave up its claim to much of Patagonia, which it considered as a useless desert. However, Chile still had one unresolved border dispute, and one claimed territory it does not control. This territory is Antarctica, where Chile claims this slice of the continent through claiming that said part of Antarctica had been given to it by Spain when Chile was still a colony. Territorial claims to Antarctica are all in limbo as a result of the Antarctic Treaty, which freezes all territorial claims on the continent. The final border dispute Chile has is with Argentina. It concerns the border through the Patagonian ice field, seen here. This dispute is on ice for the moment, since it concerns a piece of ice that neither side spends a lot of time in. Maybe the ice sheet will melt and tensions will freeze over between the two countries. But in the meantime, Chile's modern borders were born as much from its sea power through ocean supply lines and strategic waterways as it was by the Andes Mountains. If you enjoyed this and want to see more, then subscribe. New videos are on the way.